Okay, so I'd love to welcome Grace Johnson from Hedgehog Street here today, who is going to talk to us about hedgehog threats and conservation. So over to you, Grace.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Kieran. I'm assuming you can see my slides and hear everything okay.
Perfectly well.
Lovely. Thank you. Just give me a shout if there's any problems. So yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about hedgehogs, which along with you is pretty much my favorite topic of things to talk about. So that's good. It's brilliant to see so many people as well. This is the biggest number I've ever seen on a webinar, and I think it's the power of hedgehogs, isn't it? It really attracts people, which is fantastic. So yeah, welcome. And thanks so much to Hugh for that really good just intro to hedgehogs, all about their behavior, nesting, all of that sort of stuff, which leads very nicely into the topic of my talk, which is all about threats and conservation. So when talking about threats and conservation, I thought it would be quite helpful just to look at how the population is doing as a bit of a starting point, kind of how are hedgehogs doing, where are we at the moment in comparison to kind of years gone by. So what do we actually know about British hedgehogs? So every few years, we produce a survey, the State of Britain's Hedgehogs report, and that's based on survey data. So it's by two charities, the ones that Hugh and I are representing this evening. So the British Hedgehog Preservation Society and People's Trust for Endangered Species. We produce this report every few years to just look at how hedgehog populations are faring. So the most recent report was back in 2022. And we found increasingly apparent differences in urban and rural areas. So the reports that had gone before that had started to see that there was a bit of a difference between these two areas. And this 2022 report really kind of sealed that. In urban areas, it's a much better picture. So it's quite interesting. So what we're seeing is a stable population that's showing signs of recovery. But it's really important to view that in the context of the quite catastrophic declines that have gone before. So they've been declining for a number of years, but that decline's just starting to level off and there's signs of improvement. So we're still kind of well down on numbers, you know, they're not back up to where they should be, but there's a little glimmer of good news there, which is good. In rural areas, conversely, unfortunately, populations are remaining low. So we've seen declines of between 30 and 75% nationally, you know, in different areas since the millennium. So yeah, certainly a worrying picture on the rural side of things. I've put there that they're red listed as well. So the red list is, some of you might have heard of it, the IUCN Global Red List. It provides the kind of global extinction risk of different species, sort of plants, animals. So on the UK red list, they're listed as vulnerable to extinction. And their global classification, it's a European species. So we say global classification, but it's really the European one. They've recently, it's gotten worse, unfortunately. They've gone from being classified as least concern recently to near threatened. So unfortunately, a step in the wrong direction. So quite a worrying picture overall, really. So in terms of threats and conservation, this is a perfect time to be talking about it. It's fortuitous timing, because over the last couple of years, we've been looking at these in detail and coming up with this, which is Britain's National Hedgehog Conservation Strategy. So hopefully lots of people saw this when we published it last year. It's not too long ago, it was October that we published this new document. It was a couple of years in the making, lots of different stakeholders involved in that. With the strategy, we've identified key threats to hedgehogs here in Britain and also strategies to try to address those threats as well. So we had lots of different people involved. We had lots of hedgehog researchers, lots of conservation organisations. You know, we had the usual suspects, people like RSPB, wildlife trusts. But then what we tried to do is really broaden it out. So we invited major landowners and land managers. So we had Network Rail there. They obviously manage all of the railways in Britain, National Highways, who manage road verges, green space management companies. And really crucially as well, we had representation from the hedgehog rehabilitation community. Farmers were there as well. So we really just tried to broaden things out as much as possible. So yeah, this was published last year, and I'll talk through a little bit more about it. So I thought it would be helpful to take you through the process that we went through to develop the strategy before going into the actual content. So hopefully this will help to just kind of understand the process and how we made some of the decisions in relation to the key threats that we identified. So the process to develop this strategy, it was 2 workshops. So the first one was a threat analysis workshop. So this was, we had a lot of researchers there, kind of people who work regularly with hedgehogs. And this was the rough sort of process of it. I mean, really, we wanted to list out all of the threats and really kind of do a deep dive into what we're looking at, kind of what are the problems, how are they all linking together. So we did a group mind map. There were hundreds and hundreds of post-it notes involved in that. You can see on that picture on the right-hand side there. And really what we tried to do is just list absolutely everything we could think of. So it was all the way down from kind of accidents to individuals in the garden, all the way up to things like climate change and absolutely everything in between. We then kind of clustered those threats. So there were some things that fitted into nice kind of groupings. So things like urban and rural, as an example. We put together causal flow diagrams, so looking at the drivers and consequences of each threat. So as an example of that, we've got this trend at the moment for really tidy gardens. Hugh sort of mentioned that, this cult of tidiness. That unfortunately can lead to people going out with sort of dangerous pieces of equipment, things like strimmers, and that unfortunately can injure or even kill hedgehogs. So that's kind of the cause that's linking to the threat. We looked at threat patterns as well. So direct threats and indirect threats. So a direct threat would be something like that strimmer accident. It would be something like roadkill. It's directly causing that mortality of hedgehogs. An indirect threat would be something like climate change. There's a few kind of intermediate steps. That's not directly kind of, causing a decline in the population, but it's affecting weather patterns. There's just those few sort of steps in between. We also identified knowledge gaps as well. So there's a lot that we know about hedgehogs from a lot of research. Hugh's mentioned some of that. There's also a lot that we don't know, though. And for every piece of research, it kind of, it raises more questions. So it's a bit of an unending journey, really. So as part of this process, we identified what we know, what we don't know, where is there research that we can take from other similar species and try and apply it to hedgehogs. So we just really tried to hash out all of this and just understand the full picture of what we're looking at. So we had all of these causal flow diagrams for different threats. We mapped them all out and then sort of linked them together. And what we came up with was this. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a read through that. I'm only joking. That, of course, is not possible to read because it's an absolute mess. So the red box in the middle there, obviously you can't read it, but that's a decline in the hedgehog population. That's that central thing that we're looking at. And all of these around the outside are the direct threats, the indirect threats, the sort of drivers, the consequences, all of these things. And really, this is just to show the complexity of what we're dealing with. This is a species that's found across lots of different habitats, urban, rural, all areas of England, Wales, Scotland, that, they are sort of quite widespread. So they're coming up against lots of different threats, which is makes our job quite challenging. So the next thing that we did was a 3-day strategy workshop. So we had all of those threats, and then we took those forward, and we sort of had a 3-day workshop with all of these stakeholders there to try to hash out what we're going to do in terms of addressing them and what are the strategies that we need here to move forward with our conservation work. So I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail as the slides go on, but in short, we came up with a vision. So the strategy is a 30-year strategy. So it's kind of, what do we want to see at the end of that? What's the overarching vision of the strategy? We prioritized the threats. So we had this absolute mess of threats that I put on that previous slide. So we had to kind of, we can't address absolutely everything. So how many was it feasible and which ones did we want to choose? That was really important. We came up with goals and strategies for those threats. And then within that as well, research priorities too. And just a note about the stakeholders here, it was, as I say, we had really good representation from different sectors, really diverse knowledge. We're a lot of hedgehog people, but with the best will in the world, we can't really know the intricate details of infrastructure, development, farming, all of those sorts of things. So having that kind of external input was absolutely brilliant. All of these stakeholders were bringing their individual knowledge, all of their different experiences. So it was absolutely fantastic. So it was kind of anybody who could influence the strategy or anybody who could be influenced by the strategy was there at that workshop. So it was busy. So first of all, the vision. This was the kind of what's the overarching kind of theme of the strategy. It's quite general. So this is what we came up with for that. So wild hedgehog populations thriving from towns to countryside, supported through our combined actions, meeting the needs of people and nature. And these terms are all very carefully thought through. There's a lot of thinking that's gone into these. And all of these terms have definitions and success criteria in the main strategy document. And that's so that we can kind of monitor how we're progressing in terms of reaching this vision. So the next thing that we did was try to prioritize all of the different threats. So as a group, we decided on these based on two factors. So we looked at which of the threats are the most pressing, but also which of those can we most easily address, because there's some things that, you know, with the best will in the world, we can't address within the scope of a hedgehog strategy. We can't, unfortunately, sort of solve climate change, even though that would be lovely. So it was kind of what can we feasibly do within this kind of framework that we've got here. So the first one probably isn't going to come as much of a surprise. It's a decrease in availability and distribution of natural food and associated habitat. So as Hugh's mentioned, they're going to be feeding on those lovely macroinvertebrates in the garden and out in the wider countryside. But we have unfortunately seen documented declines in those species. And also the habitat, you know, the lovely wild areas, that, you know, that brambly area that was in one of Hugh's slides, a lot of those areas have been removed. Unfortunately, it's really a consequence of the way humans have managed and changed the landscape. So this was the number one threat, and that was sort of quite unanimously decided. The next one was increased vehicle collisions. That one kind of speaks for itself. It's really quite a visual reminder of the hedgehog decline, because it's something that we all see. You know, certainly I see hedgehog roadkill quite frequently. It's a real shame. And it's sort of a visual reminder of the, you know, the struggles that this species faces. So the next couple of threats were linked to, more directly linked to humans. So this one is mortality due to human intervention. So this needs a little bit of explanation. This is things that humans are doing deliberately, and they're well-meaning, but it's things that could have detrimental effects. So supplementary feeding, as an example, you know, of course that does have benefits. It's something that we tell people to do to help hedgehogs in the garden, but that we're starting to see that there could be negative side effects. So I'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment, but things like disease transmission, possibly becoming dependent on the food. It's that kind of acknowledging that there could be a bit of a downside to that as well. The next one also links to people, unfortunately. And it's very much linked to things that are happening on the accidental side of things. So as I mentioned earlier, it's those strimmer accidents in the garden, falling into high-sided ponds. You know, robotic lawnmowers are becoming more popular, and they can be really dangerous for hedgehogs. So that's all of those kind of accidental things that are happening. The next one is toxin accumulation. So within the strategy, we focused on microplastics and rodenticides. Pesticides are obviously a really big one, but they kind of got featured in that first threat. So they're not sort of covered in this one because they've already been looked at in the first one. The final one is genetic isolation. I've put a bit of an asterisk next to that one. So that one very much links to the first threat, as it's a result of fragmented habitat. So when we came to put together goals and strategies for all of these things, a lot of the points that we were putting for genetic isolation kind of came under that first threat. So we say that it's 6 kind of key threats, but really when in practice it was 5, because a lot of the things that we would do to overcome that fragmented habitat were kind of being done within that first threat, the decrease in that sort of distribution of good habitat for them. So for each of those threats, we put together a goal, or more than one goal for some of them. So what is the change that's needed to counteract each threat and also the desired result? We put together strategies as well, so the ways in which we're going to be trying to achieve those goals. We did potential actions as well. So crucially, this is a strategy. It's not an action plan at this stage, but we wanted to include some examples of the types of work that we would be doing to kind of implement the strategies. So there's potential actions in there, but the next stage of the process that we'll be doing is putting together action plans where we'll really go into the detail of what we're actually going to do. And then we had success indicators as well. So the mechanisms that we're going to use to monitor the actions that we're taking and the consequences. So how are we doing? Are we actually making an impact with what we're trying to do? So I thought it would be helpful to go through some of the content. So I'll focus on goals, but weave in a bit of the, some of the things that we'll do and some of the success indicators as well. So just as a reminder, a goal within the strategy is quite an overarching statement. It's basically what change is needed to counteract each threat and what's the desired result. So this is quite top level stuff. We're going to be kind of doing a lot of this sort of within PTS and BHPS. We're going to be working with the stakeholders. We're going to be working with government agencies. But there are lots of ways that everybody can help, whether you've got a garden, whether you don't have a garden. So we can all do these things. So when I'm going through this, I'll kind of highlight how these overarching things link to individuals and what we can all do. So focusing first on the first threat, which was a decrease in the availability and distribution of natural food. The first goal for this one is to basically improve connectivity in rural areas. So we want to be seeing wildlife corridors. We really want to see wildlife-friendly farms that are well connected. So really trying to look at things on a landscape scale. Working with government and working with farmers on new schemes. So I know that ELMS has been mentioned in the chat a little bit earlier. So that's the new environmental land management schemes. We also want to look at other rural land as well. So railways, road verges, those stakeholders were present at the workshop. And try to improve that connectivity in rural areas. The next one, again, is about connectivity and sort of permeability for hedgehogs, but it's more focused on urban and rural areas. So we want to increase that connectivity in towns and villages. So very much continuing the work of Hedgehog Street. It's all about hedgehog highways. So these are the small gaps in fences that let hedgehogs through. So in terms of working towards that goal, we're going to be continuing our work with developers. Trying to ensure that new build sites are permeable to hedgehogs. We also want to work with local communities, local planning authorities, fencing companies we've done a bit of work with. All of these stakeholders can be creating hedgehog-friendly fencing. So my first top tip of the evening is, of course, hedgehog highways. And I've got a good little video here. I'm sure you all know what they are, but just in case, here's a nice example of what they do. So it's just a small gap in the fence, or it could just be a channel underneath. And it just means that hedgehogs can get through. If that gap wasn't there, the hedgehog would be stuck on the other side. It couldn't get through to all of the lovely invertebrates and all of the other hedgehogs that are on our side of the fence. So it's just creating that access. It's so, so important. I love that video. So we're going to do a quick poll. So Kieran, if you could bring the poll up on the screen. So we're going to see, perfect, thank you. So this is pretty cool. So, oh, amazing, can see lots coming in. So it might be that it's a dedicated one with a nice little sign on it, or it might just be that it's a natural gap in the fence because your fence is falling apart. You might have dug a channel underneath. It might be in a side gate. Whatever your hedgehog highway is doing, let us know. It's leaning towards the yes, which is always good news. Oh, fantastic. So there's a few no's, but I'm sure those are people who potentially don't have a garden or are going to, as soon as the weather turns nice, they'll be going outside and putting a hedgehog highway in. So brilliant. This also helps with just seeing who's awake at this stage of the webinar as well, this stage of the evening. Brilliant. Cool. Right, I'll end that. But yeah, thank you very much for voting on that. That's great to see. Just close that down. Fab. So still staying with that first threat, this first threat has quite a few goals because it's quite a big, meaty, chunky threat. It's one that we, there was a lot of different things that we wanted to kind of address within that. So the next goal for this one was to enhance plant diversity, both structure and species, and also complexity within the urban environment. So we want to be working with gardeners, with homeowners, trying to promote the planting of diverse species. This in turn is going to increase the abundance of that lovely macroinvertebrate prey that hedgehogs need. As well as gardeners at home, we want to be working with green space managers. We want to kind of get that lovely planting in kind of parks, green spaces, working with developers who have sort of shared land within development sites. And that brings me nicely on to our next top tip. This is something that you can kind of take away and do in your own garden at home. Wildflowers and having wild patches as well. So I've said this once, I'll say it again, but my favorite tip to give people is wild patches, because it's like your lovely lazy tip, but that's going to really help. So choosing either a corner of the garden or a strip down the side maybe, and just letting it kind of go completely wild. Let the grass grow really long, let the wildflowers in. You could kind of enhance it a little bit with something like log piles, leaf piles, compost heaps. You could have a wildlife pond in there if you're feeling adventurous. Just make sure it's got a sloping side in case any hedgehogs fall in. And yeah, that's a really nice one, because what that's going to do is increase the macroinvertebrate abundance, and also provide nesting materials and nesting opportunities for them. So that's a really nice one. That's certainly one that it's worth having a designated wild patch. And that's going to help lots of other species as well as hedgehogs as well. So it's a nice one. So this is another goal that's focused on the rural landscape. So again, still staying with that first threat. So with this one, we want to increase the quantity of quality, functioning and connected habitat within the countryside. So again, wildlife friendly habitat on farms, working with farmers, working with government, sort of supporting these government funded incentives. If there's new schemes coming in through, we want to be involved in the consultations to make sure that they're going to be sort of benefiting hedgehogs. And my next top tip for this one is, if we've got any farmers in the audience, wildlife friendly farming. So I'm sure there's, people are doing lots of things already, but things like well-managed hedgerows, beetle banks, smaller fields, grassy field margins, all of those things. We've got lots of information on our website for farmers who are looking to help hedgehogs and other wildlife. The next one is to encourage the responsible and targeted use of pesticides and veterinary medicines that impact ground and soil environments. So we want to reduce those negative impacts that these substances can have on, again, that hedgehog prey. It's those macroinvertebrates. So again, we want to be working with farmers on this, and also really trying to reduce the negative effects of chemicals in public green spaces as well. So allotments, gardens, things like that as well. And the top tip for this one that everybody can do is just to go chemical free in the garden, just garden organically. It's as simple as just try and avoid chemicals at all costs. This is the final goal for this first threat. Don't worry, they're not all as long as this one. This was just a particularly chunky threat. So this last one is, we want to elevate the status of hedgehogs within legislation and policy. So it's something we've tried to tackle before through changes to the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which is one of the key pieces of legislation that kind of protects hedgehogs and other species. Helpfully, there's a lot of public support when it comes to these things. People love hedgehogs and really want to see them well protected, but we haven't really seen any changes as yet, unfortunately. So we're going to continue working towards this goal, but we want to also ensure that hedgehogs are considered in other legislation. So not that direct protection, but when things like ELMs, environmental land management, LNRSs, local nature recovery strategies, when they're developed, they're kind of being done in the best possible way for hedgehogs and other wildlife. So the top tip for this one is to write to your MP. So there's certainly a lot of changes that are happening at the moment, changes to planning. And it's a good idea to sort of write to your MP at this moment in time to urge them to lobby for hedgehogs and other wildlife. And I was actually on the RSPB website earlier, and they've got a good kind of template letter that you can send to your MP, because it's difficult to know kind of what you want to say specifically, but they've got good information on there. So moving on to the next threat, finally. This one was increased vehicle collisions. That was that second threat that we had on the list. So the goal for this one, just the general kind of what we want to see, is we want to reduce road collisions in order to allow hedgehogs to move through the landscape safely, contributing to secure populations. So we're going to be supporting efforts to reduce vehicle speeds. We're not going to be lobbying for reduced speeds specifically for hedgehogs. There's a lot of kind of 20-mile-an-hour zones being introduced, and they can have benefits for humans, but also for hedgehogs. So we want to be working with councils to support those new kind of traffic calming measures. And really what we want to see with this one is a reduction in hedgehog roadkill numbers. But, you know, admittedly, this isn't going to be the easiest problem to solve, but we're certainly going to do our best. So the next threat was that mortality due to human intervention. So it was those well-meaning things that people are doing, but just having those potentially kind of unintended side effects. I've just realised I'm missing a bracket at the end of that threat. So this one kind of breaks into two main strands. So the first one was around sort of inappropriate admission to care. This was sort of perceived to be a bit of an issue because of hedgehogs' ecology. If they're sort of approached by people, they're not necessarily going to run away like another species. As Hugh was mentioning, they will just curl up into a ball. And a consequence of that is that there's an element of kind of people picking them up thinking that they need help. So it's well-meaning, but then kind of taking them to rescue centres, sort of incurring quite a lot of stress within the animal when that's not necessarily needed. There's sort of follow-up data that says that might not be as much of an issue, but it's something that we're certainly going to look at. So we'd like to sort of do some education for people around hedgehog ecology so that people know what's normal and when to be concerned, and try and combat some of the misinformation that's floating around online as well. There's a video, if that's going to play. Yep, there we go. So the second strand of this one is all about supplementary feeding. So you can see these lovely hedgehogs having a feed there. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, this is something that we're encouraging people to do, and it does definitely help. There's definitely positives for that, but we need to acknowledge that there's potential downsides as well. So you've got issues around disease transmission, possibly becoming a little bit too dependent on the food. It could be disrupting natural cycles like hibernation. If there's ample food, maybe that's going to delay hibernation. Disruption of natural behaviours as well. So it's bringing a solitary species kind of together unnaturally. So we know that aggression can be a bit of a problem. Obviously, these two are not having any aggression issues, but it's something that research has shown can be a bit of a problem. So we don't know that these are issues. These are just things that were discussed in the workshop. There's no evidence for these except for the aggression. But it's something that we want to look at, because if you look at feeding birds as an example, it's something that's such a widespread practice. But actually, we now know that there's a lot of disease transmission issues. There's various issues. So we just need to kind of look into this one. Just conscious of time, so I'll try and run through the last bits really quickly. So the top tip for this one from the strategy is to try and focus on natural food in the garden. So we're not saying not to feed hedgehogs. That's certainly going to be helping them in leaner times. But we just want to make sure that people are cleaning and disinfecting bowls just in case there are sort of any disease risks. And we also want to just encourage that natural prey for hedgehogs. We want to see kind of more of those lovely invertebrates in the garden, and that's a more sustainable option. And then the supplementary food really can just kind of top that up, rather than being the main food source, which we're concerned that in some places that does seem to be the case. So there's a lot of unknowns with that one. So it's, yeah, just, you know, feed them in the garden, but just make sure you've got all those wildlife friendly features as well. So they've got that access to that natural prey as well. The next one was the accidental death. So that's the strimmer accidents, things like that, robotic lawnmowers. We want to encourage widespread awareness and human behaviour change to try and reduce that risk. So we've got 3 strategies with this one. We're going to be trying to target and work with industry partners. So that would include local councils who manage parks and green spaces, the sort of industrial strimmers and pieces of equipment that are going out and inadvertently sort of catching and injuring hedgehogs. We also want to work with homeowners because a lot of these things are unfortunately happening in a domestic setting as well. And also with equipment manufacturers to try and work with them to make these pieces of equipment a bit safer and raise awareness of hedgehogs potentially on packaging. So the top tip for this one is think hedgehog. So if you're going out into the garden, if you're doing anything with any kind of equipment, just do a really thorough, really careful check for hedgehogs, because those nesting sites that they're using can be quite camouflaged. And, you know, people aren't going out and sort of doing these things deliberately. And, you know, when people are bringing hedgehogs into rescue centres, they're mortified that they've done this. You know, it's just we want to get this on the forefront of people's minds when they're going out in the garden. That last threat there, toxin accumulation. So we want to develop inclusive approaches to reduce and replace the use of harmful chemicals to try and eliminate negative impacts on hedgehogs, but also other non-target wildlife as well. So in terms of plastics, we know that microplastics can end up in hedgehogs. Research has shown that. So we want to support existing schemes and organisations that are working to reduce plastic in the environment. So collaborating with existing schemes, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There's a lot of great organisations that are doing this. They're working on things like policy, awareness around litter. In terms of rodenticides, which was the other one we were looking at, we want to encourage alternatives to toxin-based rodent control. So again, collaborating with existing projects and schemes. And again, we do know that rodenticides show up in hedgehogs. You know, we've done necropsies where we find these substances. So my top tip for this one is a bit of a new one. It's quite a general one, really just trying to reduce that plastic pollution. So, you know, reusable bottles, keep cups, things like that. And litter's a really important one within that one. So try and, you know, if you see any litter out on the street, because even things like those elastic bands that get dropped a lot, hedgehogs can get their legs tangled in those. Crisp packets, they've got those lovely spines on their body which make them so unique but make them so easy to get tangled up in things. So, you know, litter, netting, all of those types of things. Yeah, so really trying to kind of reduce that, you know, litter and plastic pollution. So very quickly, I think I've gone over time, but I'm getting very close to the end, so I'll just rustle through these last bits. So yeah, these were the research priorities that we identified. So we want to know more specifically what features support healthy populations of hedgehogs, as well as other species in different habitat types. We need data on birth rate and juvenile survival, that kind of basic demography, and looking at causes of mortality as well. So kind of figures on death rates, cause of death at different life stages as well. As mentioned, the potential downsides of supplementary feeding, that's really, really important. And there's some research that has started, which is looking at that, which is brilliant. We want to know about the long-term fates of released hedgehogs after they've been after they've been rehabilitated. So we know how they fare up to about 8 weeks. And then past that, we don't really know. How are they doing long term, you know, when they go back into the main population? And finally, genetics as well. So looking at the usefulness of translocations for smaller isolated populations. It's not something we currently do, but is that something that could be helpful to increase that genetic diversity? And we can also use that to look into fragmented habitat. What are the specific barriers? And all of this is going to be underpinned by our new National Hedgehog Monitoring Programme. Hopefully people have come across that. We are looking for volunteers, so we can share a link in the chat, hopefully, for how to get involved. With this, we're using camera traps across different sites to get density estimates of hedgehogs. So how many hedgehogs are at these different sites? And that's going to allow us to compare hedgehog numbers across different habitats, across different years, and we can then target conservation measures accordingly. And we'll know, crucially, you know, whether we're reaching some of those really important targets within the strategy. So you can find out a little bit more about the strategy, the full document. We've also got a lovely summary as well, which just is a bit of a lighter, more digestible version. And if you'd like to know more about how to help hedgehogs, head over to Hedgehog Street. And I'm going to leave you again with another video, which is just, this is what we want to see, people enjoying hedgehogs in the garden, lovely, safe environment for them, foraging naturally. And that's, yeah, that's everything from me. So if anybody's got any questions or anything, and I'll stop sharing.